When I was in college, I rented a small, old apartment near campus. It wasn't much, just a tiny one-bedroom on the third floor of a creaky, dimly lit building. The rent was cheap, and it had this eerie charm that I initially found appealing. But soon, I realized there was something deeply unsettling about the place. It started with the closet in my bedroom. Every night, I would make sure it was tightly shut before going to bed, but almost every morning, I would find it slightly ajar. At first, I thought it was just the door frame being old and uneven, causing it to creak open during the night. But after a while, I started noticing a strange smell emanating from inside the closet, a sickly sweet odor that I couldn't quite place. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger over time. One night, I decided to investigate. I turned on all the lights and carefully opened the closet door. Inside, everything looked normal. My clothes hung neatly, and nothing seemed out of place. But that smell was stronger than ever. I took a deep breath and started pulling out everything, checking every inch of the closet. Finally, I reached the back wall, which was covered in old peeling wallpaper. There was a small section where the wallpaper had curled away, revealing a crack in the wall. Something compelled me to peel back the wallpaper. As I did, the crack widened, and I noticed something wedged deep inside the wall, a small, tightly rolled piece of paper. My hands were shaking as I pulled it out and unraveled it. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age, and covered in faded handwriting. The note was a letter, written in a frantic, almost illegible scrawl. It was from a previous tenant, a young woman, begging for help. She wrote about how she was being watched, how she could hear whispers coming from the walls at night. She mentioned the closet specifically, saying it was a portal, that something was living in the walls, and it wanted her. The last lines were the most chilling. "It's too late for me. It's coming. I can hear it in the walls. If you're reading this, it knows you're here too." I was frozen in place, heart pounding. Then I heard it, a soft scratching noise coming from inside the walls. It started low, almost imperceptible, but quickly grew louder, more frantic, as if something was desperately trying to claw its way out. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I grabbed my keys, ran out of the apartment, and didn't look back. I slept in my car that night, and the next morning, I broke my lease. I never went back to that apartment. A few months later, I heard that the building had been condemned and was set to be demolished. Part of me wanted to know what they found in the walls, but the other part, the part that's haunted by the memory of that night, never wants to know. It was the middle of the semester, and I'd finally gotten used to the quirks of living in our hostel, until the night everything changed. Room 304 had always been empty. For as long as I could remember, no one ever stayed there. When I asked about it during the first week, everyone just shrugged it off with vague answers, saying things like, "No one wants to stay in there." I assumed it was a case of an old building with faulty plumbing or mold, but curiosity started to eat away at me. Why didn't no one even talk about it? One night, after a long study session, I was walking back to my room when I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable, the sound of furniture scraping across the floor. It was coming from room 304. The corridor was empty, the rest of the building quiet. My first instinct was to ignore it, to go back to my room and pretend nothing happened. But something drew me toward the door. I hesitated, standing just outside, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The air around me felt unnaturally cold, like the temperature had dropped the second I approached. I could hear whispers now, low and indistinct. But there, it wasn't until I grabbed the handle that I realized it was unlocked. Inside, the room looked like every other in the hostel. 2 beds, 2 desks, a wardrobe. But something was off. The furniture wasn't in its usual place. Both beds were pushed against the far wall, with one of the desks turned over on its side. The air smelled damp, almost rotten. The whispers grew louder. They weren't coming from the room, but from somewhere deeper, almost underneath the floorboards. I knelt, listening carefully. That's when I noticed it. A small, circular hatch in the corner, partially concealed under a rug. My heart raced. Why was there a hidden hatch in a hostel room? I don't know what possessed me to open it, but before I could second-guess myself, I was pulling it up, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the depths of the building. The whispers were louder now, like voices calling out, pleading. I stepped down, gripping the railing, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing on my shoulders. The deeper I went, the darker it became. My phone's flashlight barely pierced the blackness around me. At the bottom, I found myself in a small, windowless room. It was cold, unnaturally so, and there, sitting in the center of the room, was an old rotting chair. On it sat a girl, no older than me, her face pale, and eyes wide with terror. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. She was the source of the whispers. Suddenly, she turned to me, her eyes locking with mine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her mouth stretched open, unnaturally wide, and a chilling, guttural scream erupted from her throat. I stumbled back, tripping over the stairs as the lights above flickered violently. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my room, slamming the door behind me. No one else had heard it. No one else believed me. But now, every night, I hear those whispers calling from beneath the floor, and I know she's still down there, waiting for me to return. I was always the last to turn in at the hostel, night after night, while the rest of the dorm slipped into uneasy slumber. I sat at my desk, finishing assignments or catching up on readings. It wasn't unusual for me to wander the empty corridors late at night, the silence almost deafening. One evening, as the clock in the hallway ticked past midnight, I noticed a strange chill in the air. The temperature had dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath forming ghostly wisps. Shaking it off as a draft, I continued my work. Later, while I was in the common room, I saw it. The old grandfather clock that had always stood in the corner, its pendulum swinging rhythmically. The clock was never set to the right time. Its hands had been frozen at 12:15 for as long as anyone could remember. But tonight, it was different. The clock's hands moved. Slowly, deliberately, they ticked past 12:15, heading towards 12:30. A cold sweat broke out across my back. I watched, transfixed, as the clock hands finally reached 12:30 and stopped. At that moment, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the dorm into darkness. My heart pounded. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, but its screen remained stubbornly black. Panic rose as I stumbled through the darkened hallways, trying to make my way back to my room. The silence was eerie, interrupted only by the occasional groan of the old building. I felt a presence behind me, but every time I turned, nothing was there. Finally, I reached my room and slammed the door shut, leaning against it as I tried to calm my racing heart. I glanced around, the darkness now oddly comforting. Just then, I noticed something unsettling. The old grandfather clock was in my room. I must have been hallucinating, I thought. How could it have moved? But there it was, standing ominously in the corner. The hands on the clock had resumed their movement, ticking towards 1 o'clock. As I watched in horror, the clock struck 1, and a low, mournful chime resonated through the room. The sound was soon followed by a whispering, soft at first, then growing louder. The whispers were incoherent, overlapping voices, pleading and screaming in agony. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to understand what was happening. Suddenly the door burst open. I looked up to see my roommate standing there, eyes wide with fear. "What's going on?" they shouted, but their voice was swallowed by the cacophony of whispers. As I turned back to the clock, the room grew colder, the whispers turning into distinct, desperate cries for help. The clock's hands spun wildly, and the room began to warp, stretching and bending, as if reality itself was unraveling. In the chaos, the last thing I remember is the clock's hands pointing directly at me. Then, darkness enveloped everything, and the whispers ceased. When I awoke the next morning, the clock was gone. The room was normal again, and my roommate had no memory of the night. But I know what I saw, and I know that sometimes the past lingers longer than anyone realizes. And some things, once they start moving, are impossible to stop. It was one of those chilly September evenings when the fog rolls in thick, cloaking everything in a shroud of gray. I just moved into the college hostel a few days ago, and everything felt unfamiliar. The labyrinthine hallways, the echoing laughter from distant rooms, and the heavy wooden doors that seemed to groan with each gust of wind. But it was the basement, that dank, dimly lit place where we weren't supposed to go, that intrigued me most. They said it was off limits for a reason. The administration claimed it was unsafe, but the whispers among students spoke of something darker, old stories about a student who had disappeared years ago and was never found. Naturally, the tales only piqued my curiosity. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed and the corridors fell silent, I decided to explore. I grabbed a flashlight from my desk drawer, its beam weak but enough to pierce the gloom, and headed for the basement door at the end of the hall. The heavy wooden door had a rusty lock, but it was already ajar, creaking slightly with every movement. I squeezed through, my heart hammering in my chest. The basement was as expected, cold, musty, and lined with old storage bins. The air was thick with dust, and the flashlight's beam cast long, eerie shadows on the walls. My footsteps echoed as I moved deeper into the space, each sound magnified by the oppressive silence. I passed rows of forgotten furniture and broken lamps until I reached a door at the back that was slightly open. There was something strange about it. Unlike the rest of the basement, this door was in pristine condition, and a faint, unsettling light seeped through the crack. I hesitated, but pushed the door open. It led to a small room, barely big enough to fit a desk and a single chair. The light came from a small lamp on the desk, and as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that made me jump. The room was unnervingly clean, a stark contrast to the cluttered basement. On the desk was an old journal, its cover cracked and worn. My curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up. The pages were filled with cramped, scrawled handwriting that spoke of paranoia and fear. The entries grew more frantic as I read. The writer described hearing whispers and seeing shadowy figures in the basement, always just out of sight. They wrote about feeling watched, followed by a malevolent presence. The last entry was the most chilling. They are here. They want me to join them. As I read the final words, a chill ran down my spine. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and the lamp flickered. I heard it then, a whisper, barely audible, like a breath against my ear. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room felt suddenly smaller, suffocating. The shadows seemed to dance along the walls, and I could hear faint scratching sounds from the other side of the door. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in. I pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The scratching grew louder, closer. I could feel a presence in the room with me, something cold and malevolent. I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight, but it slipped from my grip and clattered to the floor. The whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand, but that filled me with dread. In a moment of pure terror, I grabbed the journal and threw it at the door, hoping to somehow break the spell. The scratching stopped abruptly, and the room fell silent. I listened, heart pounding, before carefully pushing the door open. The basement was, as I had left it, cold, dark, and silent. The lamp on the desk had gone out, and the journal was gone. I fled up the stairs, not stopping until I was back in the safety of my room. To this day, I don't know what I encountered down there, but the basement remains locked now, and the whispers in the hostel have grown quieter. They say the student who vanished before me was never really gone, just waiting in the shadows, waiting for someone to find what they left behind. It was the first week of college, and everything was new and exciting. My roommate Jake and I had settled into our dorm room, a modest space with 2 narrow beds and a single window overlooking the courtyard. The college was old, steeped in history, and the hostel itself had its own eerie charm: creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and the occasional draft that made the hair on my neck stand on end. One evening, while Jake was out with friends, I decided to explore the hostel a bit more. The upper floors were all student rooms, but there was a basement that was rumored to be off limits. Of course, that only made it more tempting. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the hallways grew darker, I grabbed my phone, its flashlight function providing a weak beam. I crept down the stairs, each step echoing ominously. The basement door was heavy and metal, with a faded no-entry sign that had seen better days. I pushed it open, the hinges protesting with a loud groan. The basement was an old, cluttered storage area. Dust-covered furniture, abandoned equipment, and broken appliances filled the space. The air was musty, and the weak light from my phone barely cut through the gloom. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange: a door at the far end of the room, partially hidden behind a stack of old crates. Curiosity got the better of me, so I approached the door. It was an old wooden door with a tarnished brass handle, completely out of place among the other discarded items. It looked almost like it led to a different era. I hesitated, but eventually turned the handle and pushed the door open. It led to a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with shelves that held old, tattered books and ancient-looking boxes. In the center of the room was an old armchair facing a dusty fireplace. On a small table beside the chair was a faded photograph in a cracked frame. I picked up the photograph. It was a black and white image of a group of people in old-fashioned clothing, standing in front of what looked like a grand building. Their faces were stern, and something about their expressions unsettled me. I set the photo back on the table and turned to leave, but something caught my eye, a faint scratching sound coming from the corner of the room. I froze, listening intently. The scratching was persistent, rhythmic, like something, or someone, was trying to get out. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly approached the source of the noise. It was coming from behind a loose panel in the wall. I tugged at the panel, and it gave way with a creak. Behind it was a narrow, dark passage. The scratching sound grew louder, more frantic. Against my better judgment, I crawled into the passage, guided only by the beam of my phone's flashlight. The passage was cramped and winding, leading deeper into the darkness. The air grew colder, and the scratching turned into frantic, desperate clawing. I reached the end of the passage, which opened into a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was a stone slab with old blood-stained chains. The walls were covered in strange symbols and drawings, and the scratching sound had stopped. I felt an icy chill wash over me, and my flashlight flickered wildly before going out completely. Panic set in. I scrambled to get out, but as I turned to leave, I saw something that froze me in place. A shadowy figure in the doorway, its eyes glowing an eerie green. It didn't move, just watched me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape. The passage seemed longer than before, the walls closing in on me. I could hear whispers, faint and unintelligible, growing louder with each step. I burst out of the basement door, slamming it shut behind me, and racing back to my room. Jake returned later that night, and I tried to tell him what had happened, but the words caught in my throat. He just laughed it off, as my imagination running wild. I never went back to that basement. The next day, I noticed the door was sealed shut, the handle gone, and the no entry sign replaced with a new stern warning. The whispers continued, but they seemed more distant now. I don't know what I saw, or what was clawing at the walls, but whatever it was, it left me with a chilling reminder that some places are best left unexplored.